My inaugural state visits to our two important ASEAN neighbors were fruitful and engaging. Ito po ang isa sa mga ipinangako ko nung nakaraang SONA at naisusulong natin ang foreign investment upang lumakas ang ating ekonomiya. Today, we shine a spotlight on Asia's fastest rising star, the Philippines. In the next few years, our economy is expected to outperform our regional peers. My administration is committed to establishing an even more competitive business climate conducive to high-value investments.
From the nation's capital, all sides, all the time, I'm Jess De Los Santos.
And I'm Gretchen Hall. The big story tonight.
Fishers Group PAMALAKAYA says there is no shortage of tamban in the country.
That's contrary to the statement of manufacturers who use tamban to make canned sardines. In an interview with the Chiefs, PAMALAKAYA Chairman Fernando Hicap insisted that there is no need to import tamban in the Philippines. Instead of importation, Hicap urges big manufacturers to buy tamban from municipal fishers.
Kasi ang pangisdaan po sa ating bansa ay merong tamban. Meron silang kakulangan doon sa huli ng kanilang mga commercial fishing vessel. Bakit hindi nila bilhin, no? Yung huli ng mga maliliit na mangisda. Kung merong market, no? Kung merong market at doon bibilhin ng mga kaning factory sa mga maliliit na mangisda, ayun na dapat ang gawin.
Meanwhile, Hicap said that the biggest reason why there is low supply of galunggong in the country is the West Philippine Sea issue. Hicap explained that 70 to 80% of galunggong comes from the West Philippine Sea. But due to alleged harassment by the Chinese Coast Guard, local fisherfolk are finding it difficult to catch galunggong.
Laging nakakaranas ng mga harassment, no? At may mga kaso pa na inaakyat ng mga Chinese Coast Guard yung mga pangisdaan natin ng mga Pilipino at kinukuha yung isda. Kaya yun, no, yung sinasabi natin na balikbayan talaga galing sa atin, kinuhuli ng mga Chinese at mag-import tayo galing sa China.
With regard to sardine production, the BFAR says there's actually sufficiency levels in the first quarter at 200%, in the second quarter 400%.
In fact, if you try to look at those figures, it would seem that there is in fact an oversupply.
And apart from there's a shortage and there's also an issue of overfishing. We'd like to clarify what those terms exactly mean. And with us to talk about that and more about the supply issues hounding the fisheries sector is BFAR OIC and Executive Director Nestor Domenden. He is joining us live via Zoom. Good evening and welcome to The Big Story.
Director Nestor, good evening.
Yes, and good evening, Gretchen.
Okay, let's pick up from the figures that Gretchen mentioned earlier. For the first quarter, you have sufficiency level of 222%. Second quarter, that's over 400%. So it would seem like there is, in fact, an oversupply of tamban. So given that, is there really a shortage? If there's none, then where do you think are the manufacturers coming from here?
Yeah, the data show us that we indeed have already produced for the first semester of this year more than what we have recorded, or according to PSA data, the annual production of sardines last year. So we expect that for the third and last quarter of this year, there will still be almost equal volume of sardines to be landed. And of course, that points to a surplus of production. And there are even recorded beaching of sardines in some parts of the country, and showing that we indeed have plenty or enough supply or stock of sardines in our waters.
Sir, do you affirm the statement of PAMALAKAYA that this is an artificial shortage caused by big fishing firms and canneries?
Well, the artificial shortage that they're saying is, I think it cannot be supported by data. As we look at the PSA data, we have good harvest of sardines for the first and second quarters. So unless there is or there is another agenda for claiming or telling that there is indeed the shortage of tamban. But it's clear the data would show us it's surplus.
Now, this time, can you talk to us more about the fishing policy in municipal waters? The reason why we're asking this, if we try to take a look at the data, at least coming from your end, it would show a bulk, of course, of the supply are for commercial fishers. We're talking about around 208,000 metric tons. For municipal, that's at 85,000. So, question is, hindi pa ba enough yung nakukuha ng commercial fishers? Is there actually a need for them to actually also encroach, or if for lack of a better term, gamitin din yung municipal water at least allocated for municipal fishers?
Our law says that the local government unit may allow the entry of small commercial fishing vessels in our 10.1 to 15 kilometer municipal waters, meaning from shoreline, 10.1 to 15 kilometers is that section of the municipal waters that can be allowed for small commercial fishing vessels to fish if the local government unit put it in ordinance, the clearance or allowing these municipal small commercial fishing vessels to fish in that part of the municipal waters. But that has to be put in an ordinance. So the provision is clear that the clearance or the policy to allow or not to allow the small commercial fishing vessels is lies with the local government unit.
Okay. Sir, talk to us a little bit more about the issue of overfishing, because 75% or more than 75% of the catch in Bulan Sorsogon was below the size at first maturity. Tell us more. Do we have overfishing also? We have oversupply. Do we have overfishing? And I believe the National Sardine Management Plan was meant to address these certain issues when it comes to governance, when it comes to growing and harvesting at the right time.
Right now, we are adopting the fisheries management area strategy, wherein the whole country is divided into 12 FMAs or management areas, so that we can better manage our resources, because there are no exact or similar two areas similar with each other. So that's the approach now. And there are, of course, areas in the country where population is lower, and there are areas where population is dense. So we expect in areas where more fisher folk stays there, that area is also the fishing effort is higher. So if the fishing effort is higher, then the higher is the tendency that overfishing can be experienced. So that's the balance of managing fishing areas.
Now, lastly, talk to us about the supply of galunggong. Where are we on that front? Are we at least, is that already a cause for concern here? And how likely is it? Of course, you have PAMALAKAYA alleging that, the biggest holdup here is, of course, the issue on the West Philippine Sea.
Again, for galunggong, our production data for the first semester of this year has already reached a little more than 100,000 metric tons, wherein for the past 5 years, the annual production of galunggong is ranging from 180 to 205,000 metric tons. And now we have already recorded something like 100,000 and 350 metric tons for the first semester of this year. So that shows us that we are within the range of our productivity for the last 5 years.
All right, maraming salamat po, BFAR OIC and Executive Director Nestor Domindet. Right after the break, we'll talk more about the investment pledges that President Bongbong Marcos obtained from Indonesia and Singapore after his first state visits. That and more when the big story returns. Keep it here on One News.
Apple Watch Ultra, a completely new design, reimagined with extraordinary new capabilities that expand the ways you can use Apple Watch. Every detail has been engineered to create the most rugged and capable Apple Watch ever. It starts with a case made from aerospace-grade titanium that strikes the perfect balance of weight, durability, and corrosion resistance. The titanium case extends up to surround the flat sapphire front crystal, protecting it from edge impacts that can occur during extreme activities. And at the center of the 49mm case is our biggest, brightest display ever in Apple Watch, making it easier to read in the harshest sunlight. We also added a new button, the Action button, in high contrast international orange. It's customizable and gives users quick physical control for a range of functions. The digital crown has a larger diameter and coarser grooves, and the side button stands proud of the case, both designed to be used while wearing gloves. And the audio system excels when you're out in the elements. We added a second speaker for increased volume. 3 strategically placed microphones and advanced software help ensure voice clarity on calls, even in windy conditions.
It looks great with the incredible features of iOS 16, like the new lock screen and iCloud shared photo library. You can even get more workout details in the fitness app with the new enhanced workout summary. With a larger display, you have more area to watch your favorite show or play your most intense game. iPhone 14 also has an updated internal design that improves thermal performance, which is great for staying in the action longer.
You're watching The Big Story here on One News. After nearly a week abroad, President Bongbong Marcos has brought home billions worth of investment pledges from his first round of state visits as chief executive. Here's what we know. 804.7 billion pesos. That's the total amount of investment pledges Marcos bagged during his trips to Indonesia and Singapore. He said this will support the country's economic recovery efforts and create more jobs for Filipinos. 4 cooperation agreements were signed during Marcos's state visit to Indonesia. These include the country's plan of action from 2022 to 2027, which outlines bilateral programs covering areas like economics, energy, security, and health. Now, another is a Memorandum of Understanding on Cultural Cooperation. An MOU was also signed for cooperation in the development of the country's creative economies, as well as an agreement on cooperative activities in defense and security. In Singapore, 5 bilateral agreements were sealed during Marcos's state visit. These are the Memorandum of Understanding for Digital Cooperation and Data Protection, Agreement on Regional Counterterrorism Cooperation, and an MOU on the development of New Clark City. Singapore and the Philippines also signed an MOU on water resource management. A joint communique on the recruitment of Filipino health workers was also signed.
Gagawin natin lahat na itong mga sinimulan dito sa una kong state visit ay maging makabuluhan at maitatapos natin hanggang maramdaman na ng pangkaraniwan na taong bayan ang investment na yan at mararamdaman kung gaano karami ang dinalang trabaho, gaano karami ang dinala na bagong kita na ibibigay para sa ating mga kababayan.
Employers in Singapore no longer need to submit a banker's guarantee and a performance bond when hiring Filipino domestic workers. Singaporean employment agencies and employers are required to purchase a 7,000 Singapore dollar bond when hiring a Filipino domestic worker. This requirement was an offshoot of the Flora Contemplacion case in 1995 and serves as a contract between the employer and the Philippine Embassy to ensure that the helper is treated fairly while working in Singapore. In a statement, the Migrant Workers Department said that the requirement is now lifted, quote, in recognition of the deep and abiding friendship between the Philippines and Singapore. Separate from the performance bond, Singapore is also required to buy a 5,000 Singapore dollar security bond for domestic workers of all nationalities except Malaysia. Now, to give us his insights about the lifting of the performance bond requirement for Singapore employers, we have with us on the show Migrant Workers Undersecretary Hans Leo Kakdak is joining us over the line. Hans, good evening. Thank you for joining us. What does this mean for our kababayans working as domestic workers in Singapore?
Good evening, sir. Well, basically, this means a more facilitated hiring process. The bond was, as you mentioned, essentially around the 25-year-old imposition brought on by the 1995 Flora Contemplacion case. And since then, Singapore has grown by leaps and bounds in terms of protection of OFWs. In 2017, Singapore allied with the Philippines to have the ASEAN Consensus on Protection and Promotion of Rights of Migrant Workers signed here in the Philippines, with no less than President Duterte leading the signing of the agreement or the consensus. So we've come a long way, both countries, the Philippines and Singapore. So it's high time to lift these restrictions and focus more on implementation of agreements, of laws on both sides which have developed in the last 25 years, so that we will have, or we will ensure, the protection and promotion of rights of our domestic workers and OFWs in Singapore.
Singapore said that they've been lobbying for the removal of this requirement for around 27 years. Why the timing? Why now?
Well, as I've said, in 2017, there was an ASEAN consensus. And the last 5 years or so, we've seen the implementation of this agreement across ASEAN in terms of protecting and promotion of the rights of migrant workers, especially domestic workers. And between the Philippines and Singapore, we've really seen a drastic reduction in the cases of abuse. And we see that pattern to be holding in the next few years, in next coming years. So there really should be a substantial focus on the existing laws and agreements and regulations, one of which is the ASEAN Convention on Trafficking in Persons. And one of the things that Secretary Toots Ople had emphasized is based on existing agreements, the Palermo Protocol and all other agreements, laws on both sides on anti-human trafficking, both sides strive to maintain their Tier 1 ranking with the State Department, the U.S. State Department, insofar as they have classified countries on the basis of how efficient they've implemented their anti-trafficking laws. So both sides, Philippines and Singapore, have come a long way. And it's high time to focus on implementation of all these regulations on human trafficking and protection of migrant workers. And not only that, perhaps on other developmental regulations such as education, information, and reintegration, and having the families left behind to move on by promoting their livelihood, their proper employment within our country, and perhaps even abroad. So there are so many other things to build on, to work on, instead of just focusing on the requirement of a guarantee bond.
Okay, again, these developments come at a time, of course, when there so much has developed in the relations between, of course, the Philippines and Singapore. The hope, of course, is that our migrant workers will be protected still. Again, that was Migrant Workers Under Secretary Hans Leo Cacda. Now, right after the break, let's continue the discussion on the proposed optional wearing of face masks outdoors. More details when the big story returns. Keep it here on One News.
Dependent upon artists and portraits to depict the images of the presidents and the first ladies. And so these were drawn or painted and shared and known. And that's the one image or the few images that the country had of their president and first lady. We've also continued this tradition of a portrait for our president and our first lady that go into the White House collection and that are placed in the beautiful spaces of the state floor or on the ground floor in the case of most of the first ladies. And this is a custom that the White House Historical Association has funded on behalf of the American people. The first that were revealed under our support were the portraits of President and Mrs. Johnson. Then portraits were added over time, and then there came a point for the association that we helped the White House go back and acquire portraits of presidents and first ladies where they had a gap. So those portraits would not have been painted for the express purpose of being in the White House, but we have now created a whole collection of these portraits so that it's fully covered. All 45 of these men who've been president of the United States have their portrait in the White House collection. We all know that the portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart, which hangs today in the East Room, is the only item in the White House today that was in the White House in November of 1800 when John and Abigail Adams moved in to be the first president and first lady to live in the White House. There's nothing else in the White House presently that was there on day one except for that portrait. There's been occasions where the portrait has been completed and then they thought, I don't know, maybe I want to change this. And so it went back to the artist. And so it takes a little while for this cake to bake, if you will. Famously, Barbara Bush did not like her portrait portrait. So that had to be redone. Ronald Reagan was not fond of his, and so his had to be redone. And I think another interesting point about these portraits is when they select an artist, they being the outgoing president and first lady, and they work with them to select the background, the type of feel that the portrait will have.
You're still watching the big story here on One News. The IATF is pushing for the voluntary use of face masks outdoors. But how exactly are experts and the public taking this proposed policy? Mobile journalist Jacob Lazaro tells us in this report.
Face masks went from being a mere medical protective gear to an everyday essential ever since the start of the pandemic. But with proposals to make masks optional outdoors, is the public ready to go barefaced once again? For Lola Rosalinda, a vendor in Manila, it may just be wise to wait for a few more months.
Tapusin muna itong taon na to, kaya next year makakalahati pa muna yung year 2020. Talagang wala na.
The IATF earlier recommended to make the use of face masks voluntary outdoors and in open spaces like parks. In public transportation and crowded areas, face masks is still a must, though some are still cautious over the proposed policy.
Actually, hindi po, saka may mga pollution pa po, baka po magkakos pa yun ng marami pang sakit bukod sa COVID kung mawawala po yung face mask.
While others are already looking forward to leaving their masks at home.
Ayoko ng face mask. Kasi sobrang init, di ba? Hirap huminga lalo pag may sipon siya.
For infectious diseases expert Dr. Ronjin Solante, it's a good start to easing the mask mandate. But he says the government should ensure that it will only be done in low-risk areas.
Kung maganda naman ang outcome, like cases are not going up and then people are not getting sick, no? So iakyat nila doon sa moderate risk region.
But for another health expert, the government should first establish clear-cut guidelines on which areas are considered open spaces.
I think it's important nga that the implementing rules and regulations for these kinds of policies is very clear, na hindi siya ambiguous kasi mahirap nga naman talaga.
But while experts and the public continue to weigh on the recommendation, the DOH reminds everyone that this is still subject for approval. But if it were up to them, the DOH says it would retain the mandatory use of face masks. However, the DOH says the IATF is taking a more balanced view on the matter, taking into account the proposed policy's impact on the economy. Mobile journalist Jacob Lazaro, we are One News.
It's 3x3 season once again. Catch the action starting September 10 on One Sports, PBA Rush, Signal Play, and the Smart Giga Play app.
Maglalatratag muli ang mga paborito mong PBA players sa half court. Mas pinalakas.
Riva, nakawala. He pushes it home.
Mas pinatapang.
Kamalita like second base. Flores, attacks and snaps it home.
Tuloy ang laban ng lakas ng tatlo sa PBA 3x3 Season 2. Simula September 10 sa One Sports at PBA Rush.
And that's the big story tonight. For more updates, follow News 5, the Philippine Star, and Business World online. You may also log on to onenews.ph for more in-depth analysis. I'm Jesse De Los Santos.
The big story is also available via Signal Play app. Make a free account now at signalplay.com and stream One News anytime, anywhere. I'm Gretchen Ho. Mask on, wash hands, and stay safe, Philippines.
We are One News, all sides, all the time.